Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Operation Gladio meets Secret Societies with War Hamster. Brady, how are you doing today, War Hamster?
I am good. Glad we got to get the show in. This has been an interesting week for both of us, but we had to get this one done. We've been promising it.
And why are we doing it now?
Well, because I have to run off to the Michigan game, which happens when you marry a woman who grew up in Ann Arbor. It starts in 2 hours and 30 minutes, and the clock is ticking.
All right, let's get into this.
Okay, this should be fun. Last week we're going into the Chicago political machine and everything going on in the Midwest with a couple of families related to our second favorite secret society, Scroll and Key. But there's more to that story about the Midwest corruption, etc. And I wanted to jump into that a little bit more. The themes we kept, we were going through Skull and Bones. We just kept seeing a bunch of connections to, Cincinnati, Ohio. We know about the Chicago political machine. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But how does this fit into our overall theme? I think it's important to set the table. So we talked about, Operation Gladio is about the intelligence agencies basically being the arm of the multinational corporations to take over foreign policy. Secret societies is how the elites, families, these blue blood families, put their people in the key positions to determine that foreign policy and decide where we're going to topple. Well, this goes back a long way, the intelligence agencies. I've talked about the first official U.S. intelligence agency during peacetime was the naval intelligence going after the weapon of mass destruction known as the battleship in the 1880s or late 1870s. We didn't have peacetime intel officially until the CIA is created. And again, intelligence is fine. It's when you combine it with covert operations where it becomes problematic. And wartime intelligence is incredibly important. And the first U.S. intelligence spy chief was a guy by the name of George Washington. And because Washington's spies were really effective. And it just so happens that as our storyline led to this period, my wife and I are watching the show Washington Spies, which it's really well done. It's almost historically accurate. There's, obviously they took a little bit of literary license to it, but it's really well done. I highly recommend this one. You can get it on Amazon Prime if you want to give them your business as well. But it's really well done. We're enjoying that. So I want to talk about that a little bit and then fast forward to this mid-1800s and tie up the Chicago and Midwest connections to the secret societies because there's a lot to this. So if I may, are you live on Rumble? Just want to make sure. There you are. Yeah, I just want to make sure I can see the chat.
Rumble, yeah.
I just want to be able to see the chat. Okay. So Washington Spies, that DVD I just showed you, is based on a book by Alexander Rose called Washington Spies, The Story of America's First Spy Ring. And tells this story of what's called the Culper spy ring. And for regular listeners or watchers, I'm not going to have a lot of visuals today. It just doesn't make any sense to do a Miro board on this today, but I think we'll be okay. So it tells the story of the Culper spy ring. It's CULPER. It was one of the first organized intel networks in American history. You've heard of Nathan Hale, right?
Yes.
So Nathan Hale is pretty much the United States spying Hall of Fame. He's born in 1755 in Connecticut. He's the great-grandson of a guy by the name of the Reverend John Hale, who, of course, was one of the prominent people of the Salem witch trials of 1692. By the way, that's not a good thing. Well, the Salem witch trials is such a great example of why the Puritan fanatics have to be held in check. And we're taught that the Puritan work ethic was really good for America. And in some ways it was, but I don't know. How many times have we demonstrated in this series that this puritanical class system they imposed upon ourselves may not have been necessarily such a great thing?
Repeatedly.
Mm-hmm. So he's also the great granduncle of a guy by the name of Edward Everett Hale, who's a Unitarian minister and an activist. He's an abolitionist. And this is a theme we're going to hit on a bunch today. First of all, Unitarians, and I am not going to get into a holy war with anybody. But the Unitarians of the time had a tendency to be a little bit extremist. And again, a Unitarian, really, the overall belief, and this is really simplifying it, so don't get mad at me. But they didn't believe in the Holy Trinity. They believed there's just one God and all men are created equal because of that, under that one God, and they were anti-slavery. But not all abolitionists are the same. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. But, I don't think anybody watching here thinks slavery is a good thing, and ending slavery was definitely a good thing. That being said, not all abolitionists had the same motives. And so when I say abolitionist, I'm going to get into that in a little bit, but I just wanted to set that table. Fair enough?
Yes.
All right. So Nathan Hale went to college at a place called Yale University. Here it comes. When he was 14 years old, his brother was 16 years old, they went together. He was a classmate of a guy by the name of Benjamin Talmage, who we're about to talk about. So remember the name Talmage, please. They belonged to wasn't a secret society, but it's called the Linoleum Society of Yale. This is the second oldest society at Yale. Something called Cretonia is older, but it's dead now. And it's different than the senior societies like Skull and Bones and Scroll and Key, because it was open to people that were freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors, and even some grad students. The debate over who got into the Linoleum Society is what led to the creation of Skull and Bones. So this is important. But it was a debate society. They would debate topics like astronomy, mathematics, literature, and the ethics of slavery. Some famous alumni, because we like doing that. Eli Whitney, of our favorite Whitney family. James Fenimore Cooper. You know that name?
Yes.
He's the author of my all-time favorite book and favorite movie and favorite soundtrack, Last of the Mohicans. Another guy who's an alumni was Josiah Whitney. Boy, does that family show up? Don't they show up everywhere?
Just about.
Here's one you remember. How about Daniel Coit Gilman?
That one definitely rings a bell.
Yeah, the founder of the Sheffield Scientific School, which the Colonel did a deeper dive on than I did. And, got some fun connections with that. Another alumni, Walter Camp, the father of American football. And, of course, I had to point out that William Howard Taft was a member of that as well. He's also Skull and Bones, so you could be in both, apparently. So that is the Linoleum Society, the father of Skull and Bones. So Nathan Hale graduates in 1773, becomes a teacher in New London, Connecticut. The war breaks out. He joins the Connecticut militia in 1775. He's there at the siege of Boston. And Hale would stay behind. Wouldn't go out to war. He stayed in Boston afterwards. And this is where it gets interesting. Benjamin Talmage, who's the star of this, which we're going to get to, writes him a letter, and it's really inspiring, and gets Hale to re-enlist and help him out. And he accepts a commission as a first lieutenant in the 7th Connecticut Regiment under the famous Colonel Webb. We saw Colonel Webb in Last of the Mohicans. Hale becomes one of what's known as Knowlton's Rangers. The Rangers are irregulars, militia. They were usually cavalrymen. They did all the, shall we say, irregular guerrilla warfare type stuff. And it's the first organized intelligence service of the United States. So the U.S. loses the Battle of Long Island via a big flanking move out of Staten Island. Washington is desperate to learn the location of imminent British invasion of Manhattan and asks for a spy to stay behind enemy lines. Nathan Hale is the only volunteer to do so. So he goes behind enemy lines, gets ferried across Long Island. There's a guy by the name of Robert Rogers, a Scotsman, works for the Queen's Rangers, and these are dirty bastards. They were legendary for what they did in the French-American Wars, or the French-English Wars in Canada. Rogers, who's also a great character in the movie or the series, historically almost accurate. He sees Hale in a tavern and recognized him. They apprehend him. Roberts has evidence. I found evidence on his body. The English didn't treat him very well. This guy named General Howe enables him to write letters to his brother and his commanding officers. They then burn the letters right in front of him. Remember, spies are illegal combatants. You're going to get hung if you're caught as a spy, period. You did not get military protocol. And this is where the famous quote from Nathan Hale comes in, where he says, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." And we've all heard that growing up, right?
Right.
So that's Nathan Hale, our first great spy in American history. So let's get into the Culper spy ring real quick, because it's a great story. And I'm going to do it pretty quickly because it's not the main gist, but I think it sets the tone of a couple themes that we're going to see repeating over and over again. To Tara in the Rumble chat, yes, that is the correct spelling. Linoleum. Let me see, it was linoleum. I'll spell it out for you. Hang on. Linon. Yeah, you got it spelled right in chat. Okay, so the Culper spy ring. Some important characters. Now, they're all depicted in this series, and it's done pretty accurately. They're led by Benjamin Talmadge. He's born in 1754 in Setauket, New York, which is on Long Island. Graduates Yale 1773. He's a member of the Linoleum Society and the Brothers in Unity, which is interesting because they were kind of rivals. You're in one of the two. I guess he's in both. Gets out of college, becomes a superintendent of schools, and then, of course, the Revolutionary War breaks out, and he gets commissioned as a major in the 2nd Continental Light Dragoons. What are dragoons? Usually cavalry. General George Washington makes him the Director of Military Intelligence, and he recruits a bunch of other people to become part of what's known as the Culper ring. I'll get to why they call them Culpers in a second. Real quick, just a little side note, historical about Talmadge. After the war, he'd become the postmaster in Connecticut, and then he served in Congress from 1801 to 1817 as a member of the Federalist Party, which is interesting that he gets elected in 1801 because there's the election of 1800 is when the Federalists got completely driven from power at the ballot box because they'd done things like the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798, where they took away, basically suspended the Constitution because they were taking sides in the French and English wars. The Federalists got driven out of power, but that's when then Talmadge actually gets elected when the rest of his party disappears. A couple other side notes. He defended a guy by the name of Uriah Tracy against accusations by John Quincy Adams because Uriah Tracy had led an 1804 effort for New England to secede from the United States. I bring this up because secession was always considered legal, which means the Civil War, as they call it, was the War of Northern Aggression. The South had every legal right to secede. It's going to come up again today, so I wanted to hammer that home.
Let me add, since you mentioned that he was the postmaster after just having been a spy. For those of you who are unaware, this is something that I've come across several times. Back in these days, the postmaster monitored everything because the only way to communicate back then was through the mail. I mean, you didn't have widespread newspapers. You had hometown newspapers, and knowing who was communicating with who was very, very important at the time.
Yeah, very much so. And I'm not saying Talmadge was anything but an honorable man because I can't find any evidence of that, but quite often a postmaster general or a postmaster of an area was an area of corruption. The postmasters did really well for themselves.
Yes.
that information they had was valuable. And
Correct.
the politicians, we talk about the spoils system. To the victor go the spoils. The political victors give out these nice little positions to their political buddies. Postmaster was a really cushy job to get. So I'm glad you hammered that home, because that is very much the case.
Yes. It's not like today.
Not at all. All right, next person part of this, the Culper ring is a guy by the name of Abraham Woodhull. That's Woodhull. He's an interesting story. Look him up. His code name was Samuel Culper Sr., and that's why it's the Culper ring, because they went by code names because they were practicing tradecraft. He was Washington's primary agent on Long Island, born in 1750 in Setauket, New York. Served in the Suffolk County, New York militia in the fall of 75, but resigned after a few months. The reason he got involved, again, remember, this is Revolutionary War, and we talked about the 3%ers, right? About 3% of the colonists participated actively in the Revolutionary War. There's a lot of loyalists. They call them Tories. And, if your next door neighbor's a Tory and you're a rebel, there's problems, and they're spying on each other. They're giving out information. This is not a good time to be alive. He got really motivated to get involved because his cousin, his brigadier general by the name of Nathaniel Woodhull, got captured, tortured, and pretty much brutalized. So in August of 1778, Talmadge, who's working for Washington, approaches his old neighbor about gathering intelligence. And Woodhull, or Samuel Culper Sr., is his code name, would travel to Manhattan by ferry back and forth allegedly to visit his sister. And the first trip letter he wrote was in October 1778. Washington's looking for information on troop movements, supplies, new ships coming into the harbor of Manhattan, which is the British base. So it's very important stuff he's doing. There's another guy involved named Caleb Brewster. Awesome character from the series. He's this rugged sailor and courier. He's known for his daring whaleboat missions across the Long Island Sound to deliver messages. And he's also born in 1747 in Setauket. Another big name came in later was Robert Townsend, who they ended up dubbing Samuel Culper Jr., and this is a guy who's born in 1753 in a place called Oyster Bay, New York. Why do we know that name? Teddy Roosevelt, who we covered, 2 weeks ago. That's Oyster Bay, where he's from. He's an interesting character. His father's a Quaker, which means he's a pacifist. And he gets recruited by Woodhull. The reason he was willing to become active even as a Quaker is because the villain of the story, a guy by the name of Colonel John Simcoe, who I've basically called throughout the series just Dickhead, because he really is. And they got the perfect actor to play this guy. You can't help but hate him. Every bad stereotype about the British pompous asshole, that's this guy. And he's like British intel, and he's dirty. He's with the Queen's Rangers. He took the Townsend home as his headquarters, and he'd forced them all to swear allegiance to the king. So Townsend gets ordered by Washington to remain behind enemy lines and gather intel, and he owns a shop where a lot of British officers frequented. It's a little tavern there, and that's where he overhears everything. And really valuable intel you can get in a bar. You think?
I've seen that over and over and over again. I just went through it with Gary Webb's book about the gathering of intelligence down in Costa Rica at the bar. Yeah, so.
Which one of Webb's books is that?
The Dark Alliance. We're going through that right now.
Oh, are you? Yeah, that's right. I knew that. I haven't been able to jump in. I've been so busy, but I was actually mad when I saw you starting that, because I would have wanted to do every single chapter of that with you. Webb's fantastic. I love his work. So, a few other characters. Anna Strong. She's a Setauket woman. She's the one who she would use clotheslines to signal Brewster when there was intelligence to pick up. She'd put a black blanket on the far left or the far right. So that's how they signaled. Her husband was a captain in the New York militia that got captured, tortured on the HMS Jersey. or probably did. So what kind of methods did they use? They used stuff like invisible ink, where you'd write invisible ink in between the letters of a real letter. Coded messages that were published in newspapers. Absolute secrecy. Everything was all need to know. Like Washington didn't even want to know the names of his spies. It's why they used code names. But these guys were really good. What are their accomplishments? They provided critical intel on troop movements, supply chains, and plans. They uncovered a 1779 plot to attack the French allies when Rochambeau landed in Newport, Rhode Island. So the French were just getting off their voyage. They were going to get attacked by the British. And this spy ring, the Culper spy ring, warned the French and kept that from being a disaster. So that's a big deal, huh?
Yeah.
Here's a big one. They uncovered a scheme of the British to devalue the continental currency through counterfeiting. That's going to be a big part of our story today is counterfeiting. So what's going on in the colonies at this point in time is obviously they haven't really had a sovereign government. But they still got to pay their soldiers. So they've created what's called the colonials, and the colonial dollar. And what the British planned to do was to print a whole bunch of counterfeit colonial dollars, hype them into the colonies, and basically hyperinflate. So the colonial dollar became worthless, and Washington wouldn't be able to pay his troops, and therefore the army would disintegrate.
And we know that as economic warfare.
Yes, without doubt. And it's a smart thing. It's effective. But these guys caught that and they intercepted a bunch of the counterfeit dollars. Not all, but enough. Interestingly, the British had spies in Washington's camp, and part of the intel they got was that Washington's biggest concern was money at the time. That's where they came up with this idea. But the Culper spy ring stopped it. And then the big one, of course, is Benedict Arnold. These are the people that caught Benedict Arnold through their intel. Do you want me to go through the Benedict Arnold story real quick?
Just real quick, yeah.
Yeah. Benedict Arnold was recruited by British spy master John Andre to betray Washington. Arnold was a military hero. He was the commander at several big early victories. But he had a giant ego, and he was furious that he was not getting compensated financially for his success. He wasn't being given the accolades. Long story short, he married an 18-year-old heiress in Philadelphia who had been flirting with John Andre previously. Long story short, Arnold gets command of West Point, and he's going to betray it, the Americans. He ends up getting caught, or the plot doesn't happen. He was basically deliberately dwindling the supplies and dispersing the West Point troops so the British could have an easy victory at West Point. West Point was at a very key location. It would have been a big deal had the British taken it without a fight. Talmadge ends up being the hero of the day. Benedict Arnold. Andre gets captured. They're going to try to trade Arnold for Andre. Americans aren't having it, or the British aren't having it. Benedict Arnold ended up living in England with his family and didn't get all the money he was promised. He did not have a good life, but we never got him. But that's why Benedict Arnold's the greatest traitor in American history. There's a lot more to that story, but you wanted it quickly, so I gave you the quick version.
That's the Reader's Digest version, but it's very, very important.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, it is. So that's just sort of, there's a few trends there that I thought were important. Fun historical stuff, but it really kind of set the trend for what we're talking about with the 1850s and 60s. Now we're going to jump into Lincoln's Counterfeiters. I've got this book right here. Lincoln's Counterfeiters, the Wisconsin gang that funded the Union and started the Chicago mob. When I read that headline, I had to buy the book, right? But there's a couple other books about this. One's called Lincoln's Counterfeiters, The History of Counterfeiting in America and the Secret Service. written in 2015 by Edward J. Steers. Another book called Lincoln's Counterfeiters, The Secret Plot to Destroy the Nation's Currency by Stephen Mihm. So this is a pretty big topic. You got sirens going on back there?
Yeah, we're next to the firehouse.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, that direction is the police station. Not real close, but when they come into town, they have to go right past my office window. So we get that occasionally here too. So this is the background of the counterfeiters. And we're not taught this in school. But so this is all historically accurate stuff that we're not taught, and there's a reason for it. So the background is in the 1800s, counterfeiting was rampant throughout the country, and it's estimated that almost 30 to 50% of the circulating currency at the time was fake by the 1860s. The reason for that is we've got no national currency, so the banks are issuing their own notes. Now, I'm not making the argument for a national bank because we've seen the evils of that, but having zero control was a little chaotic. And in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, this created a huge opportunity, which, of course, criminals were going to exploit. Banks are issuing their own notes. You got thousands of different notes that are easily copied. They're in circulation. And, the techniques are easy. You got crude printing presses, altering the denominations. I've got a $10 bill, and I'm just going to add a zero. Now it's a $100 bill. And these people aren't that sophisticated in our country, so it's really easy to pull off. You got some major players in this. The Gleason gang was a big one out of New York that spread to the Midwest. They specialized in engraving plates for fake notes, and they were known for really high quality forgeries that fooled even professionals. And they had a wide distribution network across the Midwest. You had a whole gang of people called the shovers, and that's in air quotes, shovers. What they did is they would shove counterfeit bills into circulation. So this is organized crime. And they'd have all these low-level people working in tavern shops and markets far from where the notes were printed, and that's how you got them into circulation. There's a small-time crooks, but they moved vast amounts of money. This was America's economy. Something called the Rag Gang, based in Ohio. Oh, where did we see that before? They were notorious for printing paper in what's called rag paper, which is similar to real banknotes. The U.S. dollar has got a special paper. They were trying to do that even back then. There's a fun one. A guy by the name of Samuel Curtis Upham, who called himself Honest Sam. He's a Philadelphia merchant. Started counterfeiting Confederate notes in 1862. Issued millions of dollars in Confederate notes that were smuggled into the South by blockade runners, Union spies, and cotton traders. And why would they do that? Well, once again, you can cause hyperinflation of the continental dollar. And I'll get into this a little bit more, but one of the main reasons the North won the Civil War was for economic reasons. And we're going to get into this more, but Upham was a big part of that. There's estimates that by the end of the war, this Confederate dollar had inflated by 9,000%. Interestingly, Upham actually got shut down in 1863. And we'll talk about that in a second, by Union authorities. And he was actually never prosecuted. But the big one is the Wisconsin counterfeit gang, which is what's detailed in this book. And that's run by a guy by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte Latta, known as Bone Latta. And they're operating out of a place called Monroe, Wisconsin. Wisconsin's not even a state yet. And it's just over the border from Chicago. Oops. Yeah. So he works with a group called what's known as the Kentucky Colony. Now, this is really important, the Kentucky Colony. This is organized crime that infiltrated all of the Midwest. You remember a guy by the name of Abraham Lincoln? And was raised in a log cabin. Do you remember where that log cabin was? Yeah, it's Kentucky.
Right.
Uh-huh. So we'll get into politics here real quick. This book is a must-read, The Election of 1860, and it talks about the four main political parties of the election of 1860. But I'm going to go into the 1850s here for a little bit. So we talk about abolitionists, and there's several types of abolitionists. Some are good, some not so good. You got people who just basically believe slavery is a bad thing, and that's a large part of the voting public that turned to the Republican Party with their distaste for the Whigs. But you also had the ones that started things like the Free Soil Party. And the whole fight is whether we would have slavery in the states, in the new territories. Now, you got an abolitionist who just thinks slavery is bad. Okay, that's fine, but that's not what the big political movement was. The Free Soil movement was they wanted soil that was free of blacks, whether free or enslaved. They were religious fanatics. They didn't want blacks in the country, period. These are Lincoln's biggest backers, and they're vicious. They are the political violence in the 1850s blows away anything you can imagine today. You had a group called the Know Nothings. So the Know Nothings, they called them that because it was kind of a secret political party. You know, are you part of this? I know nothing. That's where they got the name. What's going on is the railroads are going west. The California gold rush of 1849 has happened. And when you get more of a product, what happens? Its price goes down. So gold causes inflation. So economic times are hard. You got all kinds of immigration coming to America remember the Civil War was an economic war. The Northern industrialists had their vision of how they wanted the world to be, the country to be run. And they wanted, again, right here in this book, the platform of the Republican Party was all about the first two planks. It had nothing to do with slavery. It had to do with federally funded internal improvements and protective tariffs. That's crony capitalism. What that means is they want bigger taxes so that the government can give money to the industrialists so they can do their expansion, building railroads, steel mills, coal plants, all these things. That's what they wanted. They wanted government money to do that. That's what the Republican Party was based on. It's crony capitalism is what we're dealing with today. It's the same mercantilist system that we fought a Revolutionary War to get away from the British giving beneficial rules to the British East India Company. It's the same system Hamilton tried to propose. You know, it's not a good thing. It's mercantilism. It is crony capitalism, and it kind of rhymes with Marxism.
Kinda.
Yeah. So they don't want slavery because these industrialists who became the robber barons. It's not that they care about slavery from an ethical standpoint. It's just a bad business model because when you own slaves, you got to feed them and house them. But they got a better idea. We've got these immigrants coming in that we can force to work for pennies a day, and then they got to feed for themselves. And a lot of these are Irish Catholics moving into a Protestant country. And that's going to cause some serious problems. Have you seen Gangs of New York? Gangs of New York is a great movie. Very accurate. They talked about Tammany Hall in New York. And what happens is, and we've talked about this, you're an immigrant and you want a job. Well, you got to go to the ward boss. And the ward boss gives you your job and basically owns you. And you're living in a ghetto, and in a slum. And the ward boss, the big thing you have to do to get that job is you got to promise to vote the way the ward boss wants you to. And again, this is going on right as the Republican Party is replacing the Whigs. The Republican Party was founded by some very corrupt people. People talk about, we were the good guys in the Civil War. Yeah, okay. I'll take that argument all day long. But this Catholic Protestant thing's a big deal. You you had to vote the way the ward boss wanted you. And that's why, coming out of that, when we got some reform a couple decades later, in America, we got what's called a secret ballot. If the ward boss can't check your vote, then they can't, you can lie to him and tell him, I got my job and voted the opposite of you. The immigrants automatically were going to support the Northern Democrat Party. And so people like the Know Nothings, and there's a couple other groups I'll talk about real quick. Hang on, let me look these up. You had the called the Jayhawkers, which is a Free State militia in Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, or I think it was 1854. The battle was whether there was going to be slavery in Kansas. There was all kinds of civilian militias battling. It was called Bloody Kansas. John Brown was involved in that. John Brown was a religious abolitionist. He's the guy that would lead a raid on an armory a few years later. The whole idea would be to arm slaves so they could fight back against the South. John Brown, that didn't work, his rebellion, and he would end up being hanged. We'll talk about Brown in a little bit more, but that's part of that. He's one of the Jayhawkers. You had what's called the Wide Awakes. You familiar with them?
Mm-mm.
This is a description of them. A nationwide paramilitary youth organization formed in Hartford, Connecticut in 1858 to protect Republican rallies from pro-slavery Democratic mobs. By 1860, it had 500,000 members across 40 states, drilling in black capes and torches like a Republican legion.
Dang, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, doesn't it? Absolutely pro-Lincoln. Violence everywhere. They would clash with opponents in cities like Chicago and New York, using clubs and torches in street fights. All right. Yeah, they would absolutely march in torchlight parades guarding his speeches, Lincoln's. Then, of course, there were John Brown's Raiders, and we talked about John Brown. Anti-slavery extremist. Lincoln was a bit of a moderate compared to these people, and if you read some of Lincoln's writings, he didn't much care for black people. He wanted them to ship them off to Liberia. And Lincoln's last plan, he actually would have freed the last slave in 1919. And let me just say this for the record. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freed exactly 0 slaves, because he didn't free a single slave in the North, and he had no authority in the South. So all it was a political propaganda piece to keep the European powers out of the war. Am I being fair to Lincoln?
You're being accurate.
I'm trying to be kind. I'm holding back some of my fire for a future debate with a friend of ours who's pro-Lincoln. Matthew Arrett. How you doing, Matt? Matt's a great guy. We disagree on Lincoln and Hamilton. Right now, hopefully we're going to have that discussion. Because I do really respect Matt as a historian. He's great, and he's a super nice guy. So it'll be a discussion, not a debate. But I hope that happens. Gordon's trying to make it happen. Something comes up called the American Party in the Northeast and the Midwest. Out of the Know-Nothings. They kind of made a compromise with the Republicans. We'll support your presidential candidate. You help support our candidates. They actually won 35 seats in the House in 1854. That was the death of the Whig Party. And it was over the Catholic Protestant stuff, because the Whigs were trying to recruit Catholics. The Protestants weren't having it. These are the Puritan Protestants. They didn't want it. They wanted nothing to do with Catholics. They're also known as nativists. If you're not born on American soil, you're not American. That was basically the attitude. Talked about the free soil. Talked about Unitarians. Okay, a lot of this comes out of a place called Allegheny County, New York. That name, most of you should, when you hear Allegheny County, you should think of steel, and because Allegheny Steel is a very big company. This is really the heartland of the radical Republicans. And that was an actual term, radical Republican, because they were radical. They were the 1850s liberals, the far left, I should say. They were not liberal at all. They wanted big government. They wanted to use force to get their political aims. And that comes out of Allegheny County. This entire Monroe, Wisconsin counterfeiting ring were related to their families in Allegheny. So these are the two little hubs of where all of this corruption comes from. And they're doing this in the 1850s. And they were producing things like fake $500 Union banknotes. So we get to the Civil War and why this matters. The Union is desperate for cash. And the Lincoln administration turns to the counterfeiters for off-the-books funding because they didn't have the money to pay their soldiers and pay the industrialists to make all the munitions. So they basically printed and counterfeited their way into it. These fake notes would be turned into Union banks and funneled into the Union banks and the war efforts, and it worked. So counterfeiting can be both good and bad. In this case, it stabilized Lincoln's national banking system by injecting liquidity during the greenback shortages. Kind of a big deal, right?
Well, I'm just thinking in my head, from an economic war perspective, I see this over and over again. Again, going back to Gary Webb's book, they talk about counterfeiting as part of the funding of the Contras. We know that counterfeiting was a big deal in World War II. This is a method that is historically prevalent through all of the time, our entire history is wrapped around this single process as part of an economic warfare tool.
Yeah, ever since basically the creation of paper money, that's been the case. And that goes back to Venice, which is the people who basically created the mercantilist system, which migrated to Netherlands, to England, and then across the pond to us. So it really is fundamental.
Yes.
And if you go back to, why do we have bank runs? Well, the reason you had banks is you deposit. It was really hard to carry your gold everywhere you went. You'd be a pretty easy target for thieves, etc. So what you do is you deposit in a safe bank, and they give you a deposit slip. Well, then the banks get smart and realize, okay, if I got $1 million worth of gold, I can give out $2 million worth of deposit slips, which works unless everybody tries to redeem their gold at the same time, or everyone notices that you're giving away money that doesn't exist, and that's why you get a run on the banks.
And is that not just legal counterfeiting?
Well, of course it is. That's why the Federal Reserve's a Ponzi scheme.
And that's the point that I was going to make. How is what you just explained different than the Federal Reserve? So they institutionalized what you are talking about right now. We used to call it counterfeiting. The creation of a federal bank legalizes counterfeiting.
Yes, indeed. There's a question in the Rumble chat. Didn't he borrow money from the Rockefellers? I think if you're referring to Lincoln, the answer is no. Rockefeller had not really come into his own for another 10 years. So no, that's not the case. Another interesting, I may as well do this because it needs to be hammered home. We've got a lot of great patriots out there who I agree with on 99% of things, that believe in this thing called the 1871 incorporation theory of America. And the theory is that Lincoln, the Union borrowed all this money from the European banks, the Rothschild banks, to finance the war. And because of that, they were bankrupt. And the Vatican Bank, which didn't exist in 1871, didn't exist till the 1940s. And London, City of London, which wasn't really the City of London until the 20th century, basically took over America, and we sold ourselves out in 1871. That did not happen. Lincoln went to borrow money from the European banks. The European banks had every incentive for the North and South to split so they could probably exploit the colonies again. They didn't want a strong America, so they wanted to charge Lincoln 30 to 35% interest. No way was Lincoln going to do that. That's why we got the greenback. So 1871 Corporation is, people have debunked it on my channel many times. go look up the videos, but may as well
And
bring that
let
up.
me just add another layer to what you just said. If anything, both the Britain and France supported the South. A lot of people don't know that the cotton that was raised in the South was bought significantly by the Britons. They would ship that cotton to India to make cloth that was then made into because keep in mind at this time, India is under the control of Britain. And so they had a whole market based on very cheap Southern cotton. So there was no impetus for Britain, in addition to the instability of America, which they embraced. There was no incentive for Britain specifically, but France as well, because France had an interest, because a lot of people don't know this part either. The slave trade from French colonies in Africa, specializing in the production of rice. I just found this out like 2 years ago, was predominantly in the Carolina area. There's tons of rice plantations, and we were visiting there with some friends, and I'm seeing all of these historic rice plantation. I'm like, who knew that they produced rice in the Carolinas? And then you start researching it, and there was this whole big production in slave colonies from French colonies, and the marketing of that rice into Europe. And so they had every incentive not to help the North and a lot of incentives to help the South.
Yeah, and that's one of the problems with the protective tariffs. The North wanted to put protective tariffs on, basically protecting Northern industrialists, but basically taxing European imports. That a protective tariff is effectively also a punitive export tariff. So it made the cost of the Southern goods go up. That's why the South resisted the tariff of abominations for 30 years. Remember, the South used nullification. When every time the North would try to impose these 50% tariffs, the South would say, no, we're not doing it. And South Carolina came close to seceding many times. They nullified. This is what Lincoln was put into power to end. And if you read through this book, of the four political parties of the election of 1860, the four political parties, if three of them had won, there would have been no war and no secession. But everybody knew if the Republicans, the radical Republicans, got into power, the South would not stomach it. Lincoln was a railroad lawyer, and that's not a good thing, because a railroad lawyer's job is to basically coerce you to get off your land so the railroad can go through. A railroad lawyer's job is to take bribes from different towns, because if the railroad goes through your town, you're gonna flourish, and if it doesn't, your town's going to become a ghost town, and that's exactly what happened. So railroad lawyers are not people, and Lincoln came from this Kentucky colony of organized crime, which the forefathers of the Chicago mob and the families we talked about just last week.
And to take that into Operation Gladio, what have we discovered all over the world? These railroad barons, these oligarchs going into countries. And what's the first thing they do? Just like you said, the Sullivan and Cromwell were the international railroad lawyers, right? So they go in, and the first thing they do is buy off the elite. They create an elite class. They buy off the government. They put their people in power in these countries like Guatemala. And if the people of these countries dare to rise up in a quote unquote democratic election and vote in a nationalist who are not going to let these robber barons destroy their company or country and get cheap labor, they just come in and knock them off.
Yeah, it's the same pattern over and over again.
Yes.
And shame on us for noticing, because we're still doing the same thing to this very day.
Yep.
All right, so all these things going on with the counterfeit stuff like that, it really helps Lincoln get things like the National Banking Act of 1863 and 64 passed. This would lead to the creation of the Secret Service. Secret Service was created to stop counterfeiting.
Correct.
And they come into existence in 1865, right after, just weeks after Lincoln's death. Secret Service wasn't created for protective duties until about a decade or two later. Their first job, the reason the Secret Service works for the Department of Treasury is because they were about stopping counterfeits. And that's why every investigation into counterfeiting is done by the Secret Service and not by the FBI.
Correct.
But the FBI is a bit of an intelligence agency in itself, but all this stuff, as the Colonel said, was done by private parties. And who was actually supposed to be supervising this stuff in the 1850s and 60s? Well, that would have been the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which is what we're going to close today with. But just understand that all this stuff's going on underneath their noses, and they did nothing about it, which means they were in on the deal. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is private intelligence, private security, everything like that. This is a privatized FBI, a privatized Secret Service, and as we'll get into, privatized espionage. This ring out of Lincoln, the Bonaparte ring, would get broken up by the Secret Service not until 1873. And by that time, they'd had their foothold throughout the Midwest and established organized crime, which means the entire Chicago dirty politics was backed by these organized crime people. All right. So now I introduce a name that we just have to hammer home, because Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury was a guy by the name of Salmon P. Chase. He's born, 40 miles from where I'm sitting in Cornish, New Hampshire. Studies law and begins legal practice in, wait for it, Cincinnati, Ohio. How many times does Ohio come up in our stories?
I'd say over 50% of the time.
Yeah, you know who else is from Ohio? Oh, John D. Rockefeller.
Yep.
Also, wasn't there a certain kingmaker we talked about last week who's from Ohio? Yeah. All right, so let's talk about Salmon P. Chase real quick, and then we'll jump into the Pinkertons. He becomes a big anti-slavery activist and lawyer for defending the fugitive slaves, which is actually unconstitutional because the Fugitive Slave Act was basically written into the Constitution. He was one of the guys who helped establish the Free Soil Party. So is he a good abolitionist or not so much? All right. The Free Soil Party was an actual political party. They ran a president, and the guy they recruited was former President of the United States, Martin Van Buren. Didn't win. So give a little more context to abolitionists. He was a political reformer, Chase was. And again, there's another kind of abolition called Garrisonian abolitionists. And a guy by the name William Lloyd Garrison was the namesake of that. And he's basically an anarchist. He believed the American government was invalid due to war, imperialism, etc. Believed in individual sovereignty and Christian pacifism. He is one of the, shall we say, father figures of modern libertarianism. That's Garrison. Well, Chase was not one of those guys. He was the opposite of it. And they opposed each other. Salmon P. Chase becomes a U.S. Senator from Ohio in 1849. He opposes the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act actually gets passed. If you oppose the Compromise of 1850, that means you want war, okay? Because that's what they were trying to do to prevent war, because we had two different economic systems and very extremist views on slavery and whether slavery should expand. So if you're not going to compromise, you're going to fight. And Chase wanted to fight. Kansas-Nebraska Act effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, leads to tensions, led to Bleeding Kansas, and it led to the John Brown raids that attacked his own government. Salmon P. Chase is one of the most essential people that established the Republican Party. which a lot of these people did expose. They really opposed extension of slavery into the territories. Chase then becomes the first Republican governor of Ohio, 1856 to 1860, and he was one of the people who competed with Lincoln for the nomination of the Republican Party in 1860. Lincoln gets the nomination. As part of the spoils, he rewards Chase, names him the Secretary of the Treasury from 1861 to 64. It is Salmon P. Chase who's the one who suggested printing paper money. So if you hate inflation, Salmon P. Chase is one of the fathers of inflation. He would also facilitate the sale of over $500 million in government bonds to fund the war. That's a lot of money back then. That is billions today. He put his own face on the currency. Chase has a bit of an ego. And again, eventually he would found the Secret Service.
So during this time is when the counterfeiting is exploding.
Yeah.
And then he creates the organization to stop the counterfeiting that was going on that brought them all into power.
Yeah, and the counterfeiters who basically had more to do with winning the war than probably any general. He let it go on. He let it go on while it was convenient for him.
Right. And isn't that kind of the whole thing about everything that we've been talking about? The war on terror. Let's create the terrorist so that the war on drugs. Let's create the drugs so that we can have. This is just emblematic of everything that we talk about today.
Yeah. Cui bono? Who benefits from all this? Well, what happens after the war? You get the robber barons. Oh, and who created the institutions that are poisoning our system today? It's all tied together, my friend.
It's just amazing to me.
Yeah, and it's not taught. And that's why we do this.
So people can recognize the patterns.
Yeah. I mean, you started with Operation Gladio in 1947, and then we started going backwards, and you started saying, "Oh, wait, I've seen this before." That's why I love this series, because it's just right. It's right there in front of you when you actually do real history.
Correct.
All right, so Salmon P. Chase becomes the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court in 1864 until his death in 1873, and he's involved in a couple of really important cases. So I'm going to go a little bit off topic, because these are important to me. Texas v. White. This is where Salmon P. Chase asserts that the Constitution provided for a permanent union. I'm sorry, I've read this a few thousand times. There is no such mention. If you can accede to a contract, you can secede. They have to make secession illegal to justify the North's invasion of the South. Paramount. Chase actually says, the Constitution allows divisibility, and this is a direct quote, only through revolution or through the consent of the states. That's not in here. But he ruled that way. He would have been the judge at the treason trial of Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president. They never had a trial. And the big reason is they didn't want to put secession, basically the legality of the North's actions, on trial. Remember, the North suspended the Constitution, suspended habeas corpus. Lincoln arrested anybody who wrote a newspaper that was against the war. They're arresting American citizens. And don't tell me the war was about slavery, because New Jersey was still a slave state till 1865. They admitted West Virginia to be a state in the Union. During the war, West Virginia was a slave state. So if they were invading the South about slavery, why would they allow a slave state in? And furthermore, if legally Virginia was still a part of the Union, as they're asserting, they could not have annexed West Virginia, because you can't do that without a state's permission. It's right here in the Constitution. So by admitting West Virginia, they were saying that the secession actually happened legally. So Chase, what he does, well, actually, one of the main reasons he didn't want Jefferson Davis convicted is because Chase still wanted to run for president. He wanted to be the president of the United States so bad, even while he's the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And if he convicted Davis, it would have hurt his presidential aspirations. So the Davis defense was that Jefferson Davis had forfeited his citizenship when he seceded, and therefore he can't have committed treason, which makes sense. What Chase does is he invites Jefferson Davis's lawyer to have a little conference, and he explained a bizarre theory of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which had just been passed in 1868, that basically prohibited further punishment of Confederates, and that's a loose interpretation. This lawyer then comes to the court and repeats Chase's argument back to him, and Chase dismisses the case, and Jefferson Davis never gets tried for treason, which also means secession never got legally decided. Kind of a big deal, huh?
Yeah.
Now, I'm happy we have 50 United States. I love this country, but I think it matters how we got here. And if it's done with deceit, I'm not that crazy about it. And coercion. And at the point of the bayonet. Another really important case with the slaughterhouse cases. This happened right in 1870. It was the first time the 14th Amendment was really adjudicated. This is about incorporation of the Bill of Rights to the states. The slaughterhouse cases, which were the people that actually wrote the 14th Amendment, were alive at the time. And Chase was in the minority. He lost this. It basically, in the 20th century, we would overturn and we would incorporate the Bill of Rights, which gives the federal government a ton more power over the states. And it's a very, very bad ruling. The slaughterhouse cases got it right. Which really limited the scope of powers given to the federal government of the 14th Amendment. It was the correct decision in slaughterhouse cases. Salmon P. Chase was on the wrong side of that, but he was there. And this is a big, big constitutional question, which I talk about all the time with Doug Gibbs in our Federalist Report series on my channel. So please check those out, and I won't get too more deeper in the constitutional stuff. Salmon P. Chase would still try to become the president of the United States while being the Supreme Court justice, which is really strange. Can you imagine that today? He tried to get the Democrat Party nomination in 1868. He tried to get the Liberal Republican Party nomination in 1872, and then he dies in 1873. But there's your guy, Salmon P. Chase, one of my biggest villains in history. So let's talk about the Pinkerton detectives.
Okay.
Who were there for all of this. And I'll set the Colonel did a really good thread on Twitter. I guess two of them now. I haven't read the second one about the Pinkertons. We'd mentioned the Pinkertons last week, and I hinted that we're going to finish this show with the Pinkertons. But they are great. I'll set a little bit of background, just jump in wherever. I'm going to do this chronologically.
Okay.
So who are the Pinkerton detectives? Started by a guy by the name of Alan Pinkerton, born 1819 and died in 1884. Pinkerton is a Scottish immigrant. This is an important point. Comes to America and becomes a cooper, which I guess is a barrel maker. I think that's correct. And as early as 1844, he was working for the Chicago abolitionist leaders. Now, what have I said about these abolitionists? But he might have been a true abolitionist, Alan Pinkerton. He had a home in a place called Dundee, Illinois, and it was one of the stops of the Underground Railroad, smuggling slaves out. So, although freeing slaves is a good thing, he's breaking the law. Interestingly enough, Pinkerton was very good friends with none other than John Brown. All right, so how does he become a detective? He comes across a band of counterfeiters. He's out in the woods looking for wood for his barrels, sees them counterfeiting out in the woods, and observes them and reports them to a local sheriff. For whatever reason, that notoriety, in 1849, he gets appointed to be the first police detective in Chicago, Illinois, in Cook County. Then, in Chicago, Alan Pinkerton meets a Chicago lawyer by the name of Edward Rucker. and they formed the Northwestern Police Agency, which then became the Pinkerton Agency. Where it gets interesting. Where did they meet? Oh, in a local Masonic hall. Yeah, they were Freemasons. But remember where Pinkerton's from?
Scotland.
Scottish Rites Freemasons.
Yep.
And we're going to get to this, so this is kind of a little bit of a prelude. Scottish Rites Freemasons are really interesting. Remember we talked about you hide a secret society inside a secret society? The Scottish Rites people are very, very hardcore, very much into their Puritanism and personal self-improvement. Well, the founder of the FBI was none other than J. Edgar Hoover, was a very active 33rd degree member of the Scottish Rites Freemasons, and almost all of the early FBI guys were Scottish Rites Freemasons. So we had the private FBI, which the Pinkerton Agency became, morphed into the public FBI, and the Scottish Rites Freemasons are behind all of it. Is that a familiar pattern to you at all?
So, step 3, the creation of Gladio involved the Masonic Lodge P2 in Italy, which was preceded by P1 before World War II. So yes, it does. It's a pattern.
Yeah. It's also privatized intelligence became government intelligence in 1947, right there where Gladio started. It's the exact same damn. It happened 50 years earlier with the FBI, our national police force.
And can I share the actual picture of the Pinkertons, if you guys can see that?
Oh, I've got it up on
all-seeing eye.
Yeah, I've got it here on screen. Let me do this. I'll give you a better picture.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm going to tell the story of where that came from, too. So, but here it is. Pinkerton's National Detective Agency with a quote, "We never sleep." And that's an interesting story where that comes from. This is where we get the whole concept of a private eye. This is it.
Yes.
That's where private eye comes from.
Yes.
All right. So I'll tell that story real quick. Real quick. So after he becomes a Pinkerton Agency, Pinkerton uses his own skills in espionage, starts attracting clients, and they're growing. And they eventually, because they're such big backers of Lincoln's Republican Party and the abolitionist movement, both good and bad abolitionists, he gets appointed as the head of the Union Intelligence Service. That's why I started with Washington Spies. These are Lincoln's spies. Now, the story is that he headed off an assassination plot of Lincoln in Baltimore, Maryland. And Pinkerton didn't do it. What it was one of their detectives, a woman by the name of Kate Warney, and she was assigned to deliver Lincoln to the U.S. Capitol. And she used all kind of tradecraft, using disguises, related tactics, but it required her to stay awake throughout the entire journey. And that's where they got the motto, "We never sleep." It was because of Kate Warney. Cool story, huh?
Yeah.
That's where you get your private eye. All right, so during the Civil War, the Pinkerton agents they'd work undercover, dress up as Confederate soldiers, they're getting espionage, and it was a big deal. So they were a big part of, the Union intelligence. And these are not nice guys, by the way. They are tough. Interestingly, historians, looking back, have been very critical of the intelligence that Pinkerton provided to the Union Army. He said he would exaggerate troop movements. And if you tell a Union general that the South has twice as many troops as they actually have, you're going to hesitate to attack. So bad intelligence is really bad, and apparently he wasn't very good at it. So, a little historical side note. So after the war, what do the Pinkertons do? Well, one of the first things they're doing is they're pursuing train robbers, like the Reno gang. The Wild Bunch, which is Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The Younger Brothers they got. Pinkerton pursued Jesse James, but never got him. And he actually ended up stopped chasing him because he just gave up. The Pinkerton detectives. Now, if you picture the Pinkerton detectives, these guys in these long trench coats, top hats, carrying a rifle, rifle or shotgun underneath their coat. These are really tough guys. They would get hired to transport money, protect the trains, that kind of stuff. 1871, Congress appropriates $50,000, which is a lot of money back then, to the new Department of Justice to form a sub-organization devoted to, and this is a quote, the detection and prosecution of those guilty of violating federal law. Well, the Department of Justice couldn't do that, so they subcontracted all that work to Pinkerton, and that's when they became the FBI. Kind of a big deal.
It's a huge big deal. And by this time, Pinkerton's son, William and Robert, are also in charge of the Pinkertons. So it's a family business.
Family dynasty.
Yeah.
And the part I like about that quote is guilty of violating federal law. This is 1871, 3 years after the 14th Amendment nationalized the government more than it was ever intended to be. And now we have federal law and federal law enforcement. Had you told the founding fathers this was going to exist, they never would have ratified the Constitution.
Yeah, we weren't supposed to have a national police. And that basically is what this is. It's a national police force disguised as private intelligence and private investigators. And then, as you said, it morphs into the FBI. And what's the first thing we've learned in our Gladio series is that as soon as you overthrow a government, you have to set up a national police force, because it's going to end up being your thugs. It's the people that goes out and rounds up anyone who disagrees with the dictator or whoever they've installed in the government. It becomes a nationalized terrorist organization to thwart dissent.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and then it becomes an international terrorist organization because 1872, the Spanish government hires the Pinkertons to suppress a revolution in Cuba. Interestingly enough, these rebels in Cuba were fighting to end slavery and give citizens the right to vote. But the Pinkertons, who were abolitionists, right, went in there to crush that revolution to prolong slavery. Seems a little bit of hypocrisy there to me. Interestingly, Spain would abolish slavery in 1880, but America apparently is the bad slavery, even though we fought a bloody civil war to end it 20 years earlier. Spain doesn't get the same grief we do. All right.
And I think it's important to note, too, you're mentioning of them guarding the railroads. Who did that benefit?
The robber barons. Yeah. Follow the money.
Because internationally, that's in fact what they did as well, because they morph off into union busting in the United States.
Yeah, that's exactly where I'm going next. So, nice segue.
Yeah.
And that's a problem, though, because, well, as we go through these union busting, you're going to find that a lot of the American public sided on the side of labor. And American politicians started to realize, look, we've got these thugs that we're paying to do our dirty work, and we can't really do that anymore. So they started losing some of their federal contracts as they're doing the strike busting, because it was not politically expedient.
Because they were killing people.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So the first big one was called the Molly Maguires. This was a secret society of Irish coal miners. Philadelphia and the Reading Railroads hired the Pinkertons to investigate the unions of companies' mines. And these Molly Maguires were a secret society that were trying to strike and unionize. guy by the name of James McParland infiltrates the Irish coal miners and basically exposes them to such a degree that the organization just kind of disappears. So that was espionage. Then we had the Homestead Strike, which you and I talked about several weeks back, of 1892, which was at Carnegie Steel. Do you want to give a brief summary of that?
No, you can go ahead.
Yeah, they were striking in a place called the Homestead Mine of Carnegie, and the Pinkerton detectives were sent in to basically lock out the Union. There's violence, a bunch of people killed, shots are fired. The Pinkerton agents end up coming across on a ferry, and they're outnumbered. Long story short, 16 people are killed. It's big news. Carnegie at the time was in Europe, came back and was furious about it. He didn't want to kill his workers. But that was the Homestead Strike. It was a big part of U.S. history in labor strife.
So Carnegie Steel Company in Pittsburgh was, their job basically was railroad, and they're the ones that built most of the rails for the railroad. They were mandating everyone work 12 hours a day. And there was a union, Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, which at the time was, if not the strongest, one of the strongest unions in the United States. So they decide, because they were being paid pennies a day, which is the exact same scenario we get down in Chile when they overthrew Salvador Allende for the copper mines. Just keep that in mind. This is a reoccurring thing. And Henry Clay Frick, Carnegie's iron-fisted lieutenant, calls the Pinkertons to come in. They show up with 300 armed agents that come over on the barge that Warhamster mentioned. So basically, they were going to invade. And they show up at dawn, and there was over 3,000 strikers that were present, to include family members, by the way. This wasn't just the men, because this was there were even children there, just put it that way. So they start firing on the crowd. And the first one that they killed was Hugh O'Day. He was 23 years old. And they realize that they're not going to, because they're grossly outnumbered by the amount of strikers that were there. And some of the strikers were armed as well. So ended up with scores of people injured, and the governor ends up having to call out the state militia to not deal with the Pinkertons who attacked them. The governor shows up with 9,000 troops to crush the Union.
Yeah, the Pinkertons had a lot of political cover. You know, politics was so dirty back then, more so than it is today, believe it or not. And yeah, it's and it's one of the was a real turning point in American labor history. We got about 12 minutes before I got to run off to watch a Michigan game, so I'm going to skip a couple of the other labor busting things, if that's okay. Sure. Let's jump to 1930 with a Ford Motor Company.
But just understand, there was a lot of these. This wasn't a one-off. There's lots and lots of workers striking for better pay, because this is a predominant theory of Operation Gladio. Anytime you have effective union movements in foreign countries, the CIA, which is now the modern day Pinkertons, comes in and infiltrates the union, just as Warhamster just said, and infiltrates them, calls them communist, and overthrows the union's efforts to effectively organize against U.S. oligarchs that own mines and other railroads and other investments in that country. So I just want to show you the pattern.
Yeah, and these are the people who just were so proud of ending slavery, and then they gave all these Irish immigrants and Chinese railroad workers basically slave wages.
Correct.
It was a better business model to do it the way they did it.
All they did was remove the word slavery. They did not remove the intent of slavery.
Yeah, cheap labor. That's it.
Yes.
That's an incredibly huge point you just made there. So thank you.
Yes.
1930, Ford Motor Company. Pinkertons are hired to break the union at Ford River Rouge Complex in Dearborn, Michigan. Interesting. Something called the Battle of the Overpass. So the United Auto Workers had just recently organized workers at all of Ford's competitors, and now they're going after Ford. Remember, this is the same Ford that's financing the Nazis 2 years later. Just throw that in there. The UAW is going to hand out leaflets at this overpass in front of the main gate in the view of Ford's 90,000 employees. Before the UAW could begin, they were attacked by the Pinkertons detectives and the Dearborn police. And that created quite a bit of a stink. Remember, we're 1 year into the Great Depression. And this is going on. The Pinkertons are union busting as late as 1930. So the optics are so bad. The politicians are backing away from the Pinkertons. They're going to have to get out of that. We get the La Follette committee hearings in 1937. You get all kinds of, under FDR, some of the decent things he did. Better labor protection laws. And unions became what they are today. And of course, they would absolutely go way beyond their intended, or what they were intended to do. And the unions themselves became part of a political machine infiltrated by organized crime, etc. But that's a different story.
That brings you right back to the Mafia of Chicago. So the Mafia, yeah, exactly. It's full circle. So the Mafia, it wasn't that, in my opinion, that FDR was pro-union or anything else. They controlled the unions. So again, all they did was say, oh, now let's pretend like the unions are the unions of old, but we actually control them through a mafia of all of the, and we're going to have access to their pensions, the pension fund, all of this stuff. So now I own the unions and I control the unions, so unions are okay. The same people that were busting the unions 5 seconds ago and destroying them. And I want to mention one thing about that Lafayette committee. They were found, when they investigated the Pinkertons, they found machine guns, grenades, and an arsenal that would rival any state guard at the time. This was a war machine to mow down Americans who wanted legitimate reform from the robber barons. And so all they did, because again, that's a bad look. So let's not stop doing that. We're just now going to be pro-union, because now we're going to infiltrate the unions with the mafia, and we'll control them too.
Amen. Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Then we get the modern modernization movement, which is where we saw the rise of the FBI and other, national police agencies, which we're not allowed to have, according to this. Pinkertons would evolve through the 1960s. They actually in 1960, they took the name detective out of the name and became just the Pinkerton Agency. Their focus would shift towards threat intelligence, risk management, executive protection, and actually active shooter response. The Pinkerton Company was bought in 1999 by a Swedish company called Securitas AB for $384 million. And I'm going to do one last screen share, because the Pinkertons are still with us to this very day.
Yep.
Oops, hang on. Where is it? I just had it. Hang on. Give me one more second. My apologies. I thought it was more organized than this.
But understand, while the Pinkertons are still here, their primary duties as they were created originally was divvied up into the FBI and the CIA. and basically federalized so that we pay for them. Because keep in mind, and this goes back to my overall model where the oligarchs had private intelligence and private security, to offloading that off their balance sheet onto the American people by creating the FBI and the CIA.
Very much so. Craig Wolf in chat. I believe the deep state goes way back before there was a state, 100%. All right. It's just modern day feudalism. That's what they're trying to get back to. Here's the Pinkertons website, our story. Our roots trace back to 1850. But if you go through this whole history, you're not going to see anything about busting unions, are you?
No. You're not going to see anything about their arsenal that was discovered, about them killing Americans, nothing.
Nope. Let's say we invented the mugshot. We incorporated. That's all their history. They don't talk about any of the bad stuff.
Yeah, they created the mugshot so they could start intelligence files on people.
Yeah. That's very much so. This is everything J. Edgar Hoover did. Remember Scottish Rites Freemason, J. Edgar Hoover?
Yes.
Took it from the Pinkertons, Scottish Rites Freemasons. And
Yes.
that's your ties to secret societies and the National Police Force.
Yes.
That is our story today. And I'm really glad we got to this because I think it's a story that just had to be told.
And I just want to reemphasize again, because this is critically important. If I could, I'd stand up and stomp my feet. The FBI is a national police force. It is on par with the DINA in Chile. It is on par with the SAVAK in Iran. Every single one of the countries that we go in and overthrow, we set up immediately the national police force.
Yeah, and it's paramilitary until it becomes military, and we've got these private, we've got private militaries all over the country, all over the world. You know, we talked about that. And by 2007, over half the people stationed in Afghanistan were private military, not enlisted, and that's a problem because the military answers to a civilian authority, which holds it accountable. Paramilitary and private intelligence does not. They answer to whoever's paying them. And those are your robber barons. And that is a big stinking problem.
Correct.
Fun show.
All right. Well, enjoy your game.
I will. And I get it back to back because my Longhorns play at 3:30 today. So
tell your better half I said hello.
We'll do so.
All right.
Thanks everyone for watching. Really.
Go ahead.
Very much enjoyed the comments today in both the YouTube and in Rumble. So and in X. So thank you very much, everyone. And I think we'll jump back to Scroll and Key next Thursday. So we got some other fun names, but I think this is a fun diversion to get off the beaten track because it does tie into our overall theme really well.
It does. You just see the same patterns over and over again. And that's what we're trying to get people to do is get outside of the box that the mainstream media puts you in and look at things at the 30,000 foot view, because what you find out is history shows these patterns and how we got to where we are today. So I think that was a excellent job.
Always a pleasure, my friend. Cheers, everyone.
Ditto. See you guys next week.